Yep, all looks good.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks to Carl for inviting me to be part of the series, and to the organizers. Really appreciate being included. It's a great lineup of speakers that you have, so I'm really chuffed to be included in the list. So thanks very much. I saw that you had a presentation on urban sanitation last week, so I'll try not to overlap too much with what was discussed last week. I think I have some different perspectives from the previous speaker, but we should complement each other nicely. So as Carl said, actually I don't know if it was in my bio, but I did my PhD at the University of Toronto, and I'm from Canada originally, so that's why I don't sound like Prince William here on the call. I don't have a British accent. And I've been at Imperial since 2006. And a lot of my early work was more focused on water quality issues of relevance to the developed world, let's say. So my PhD was on UV disinfection of viruses, and I did a lot of work on disinfection byproducts in drinking water. But from about 2008 onwards, I really have focused mainly on issues of relevance more to the global south and to the low-income communities. And so the talk today I'm going to give is not too technical. It's an overview of a range of different projects, some of which are still ongoing, and they're all addressing the problem of how do we achieve safe and sustainable sanitation for all. Okay, so the title is Pitfalls in Progress, a slight pun, as we'll see as we go through the presentation today. And if you want any more information afterwards, at the end of this presentation, there's going to be a list of supporting publications, and you can always email me if you'd like to find out more about any of the projects. I always like to give some take-home messages up front in a presentation in case you drift off or whatever, you have to go answer your door or something. So if you do fall asleep or you miss the rest of the presentation, a lot of what I'm going to say has been summarized in a perspective article that I wrote a few years ago, which is available through the Royal Society of Chemistry's Journal of Environmental Science, Water Research and Technology, for which I'm an associate editor. And there's also a virtual theme issue of the journal on sanitation, specifically focused on sanitation. There's about 20 papers in that theme issue. So if you're interested in any of the specific projects or topics that I'll talk about today, I encourage you to go there and maybe check out the paper and see the other papers in the theme issue of the journal.
Hey Mike, sorry, can I just stop you for a second? A couple of people have commented that the microphone's a bit crackly. Can you maybe just turn your audio off and back on? Yeah. I don't know if it's an internet connection or something, but yeah, a couple people have just messaged that. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, don't know if that'll help at all. Any better?
Well, let's just try it.
Okay, sorry guys. I think my slides are pretty self-explanatory if you can't hear everything I'm saying. Right, so I mean, we've all heard the statistics about how many people in the world lack access to safe water and sanitation, and what are the knock-on effects of that in terms of health, but also a range of other implications. And I sometimes find it hard to picture these big statistics in terms of something tangible. It's really hard to get your mind around it. So another thing, I think, maybe if you only take one thing away from the presentation today, it might be this image that sticks in your head, that based on the current statistics that are available, somewhere between about 1 and 2 school buses full of children under the age of 5 die every hour due to preventable diarrheal diseases caused by inadequate wash. Depends on the size of your school bus and also which particular organization's estimate you're looking at, but it's on that sort of order of magnitude. And of course, this is only a reflection of the mortality of children. There's many more children who are affected in terms of morbidity and quality of life, having stunted take anything away from the presentation today, maybe keep this image in your mind, because to me it's quite a shocking one. In that, you know, if a school bus or two drove off a cliff full of kids, that would be headline news around the world. But yet this happens every hour around the world in terms of this number of kids dying. And yeah, we shouldn't become complacent about this. So, you know, the global approach to addressing this is the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, set in 2015 and meant to be achieved in 2030. And one of them, of course, is related to clean water and sanitation. But I guess a couple things to say here. One is that really the goals are very closely linked to each other. So if you are addressing clean water and sanitation, you're probably also having a number of knock-on benefits for other SDGs in the list here. For example, gender equality, if you're reducing the amount of time that a woman needs to go to collect water every day, for example. And certainly number 3, good health and well-being. So I guess probably most people on the call are engineers or scientists, and engineers or scientists, I think, have really a huge role to play in a number of these SDGs, not just the one for clean water and sanitation. And I also highlighted it just because the definitions around access to clean water and sanitation changed from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually the bar was raised considerably with the SDGs. So now the target is for universal access to water and sanitation. And also in terms of sanitation specifically, there are sort of a higher bar in terms of the description of what adequate sanitation constitutes, and it has to be sanitation that's really safe and sustainable. So to illustrate that, I mean, historically the most common toilet in the world, and probably still today, is the toilet that looks like this, which is a pit latrine. And in the Millennium Development Goals, this would have counted as an improved sanitation facility. And it still might count as an improved sanitation facility in the SDGs, as long as there's a sustainable way of maintaining the waste, for example. So, you know, there's a plan in place for when the latrine fills up and what's going to happen to that waste once it fills up. So it definitely counts. It's better than not having a toilet, a pit latrine. But there are a number of potential problems with pit latrines. So the pitfalls, to use the pun, would include, for example, the fact that it's going to fill up eventually, and a lot of communities around the world, there's no safe way to empty these latrines, or if there is a way to empty it, there's nowhere safe to dispose of the contents. So it might get dumped into a river or onto the street or back into the environment. Also, the pits are actually specifically designed to leach the liquid component out of the pit. Otherwise, the pit would fill up quite quickly. And so there's quite a high potential or high risk in some locations with high water tables for you to contaminate nearby groundwater. So, you know, there's a number of issues with pits, and it's questionable whether it would meet the definition of safe and sustainable sanitation in all cases around the world. And I should say some of these images are not ones taken by me. I've taken them from elsewhere, and I probably should have warned you about these ones before I put them on the screen. But as I said, you know, if you have a pit latrine, eventually you're probably at some point going to have to empty that latrine. And unfortunately, this is the most dangerous and you know, one of the most degrading jobs too that people have to do around the world. And as I say, you know, it might be sustainable. It might be an improved toilet to put the latrine in the first place. We have to think about the lifetime of the waste going into the latrine. So one of the projects that I'll start off by talking about was led by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and funded by the Gates Foundation through the Reinvent the Toilet project. And this developed a toilet which we dubbed the tiger toilet because it uses tiger worms, which are shown there on the left, to degrade the waste in situ within toilets. So we were looking for a very cheap adaptation of a latrine, a pit latrine, so you know, pretty well equivalent cost. But we wanted something that would last much longer, be more sustainable, not have to be emptied nearly as frequently. So the idea was that the worms, if you could adapt the environment at the bottom of the latrine, or have some kind of a container to keep the worms happy and introduce the waste to them, they would degrade it. Worms also consume other things like other dead worms, for example, and they produce a vermicompost material, which is a very sterile waste product, which is very easy to much easier and safer to empty when necessary. So whenever you have a great idea like this, you have to start with some experiments, and so that was the first step that we were involved in, and basically, from this basic schematic, you can see we had sort of a reservoir where we could mix the waste to different characteristics and then introduce it into different sort of reactors where we had different variables we could play with in terms of what was the bedding matrix there, how many worms, what was the ratio of worms to waste being introduced, how much water was going into the reactors, what drainage layers we were using. And we were able to measure what was going on from a mass balance standpoint over time, and also to sample the effluent and measure the quality of the effluent coming out of the toilets to simulate the liquid fraction leaching out of the latrines. And so these experiments were initially done at a place called the Centre for Alternative Technologies in Wales, in the UK, and actually able to build a fairly large pilot scale model of it. It was a great opportunity for me to send students up to Wales to collect some data on how the different tiger toilet arrangements were going. And so, as I say here, this is some crude prototype data, another fun. And you can see our undergraduate summer projects are about 3 months long. And so this data is from an undergraduate student project who I sent up to Wales. And it's a very simple graph. The red line is the accumulated feces that was occurring from usage of the toilets by the people in the center over the summer without the worms, and then the blue is with the worms. And so, that was an early sort of encouraging sign that actually, you could be achieving maybe a third to a half reduction of the fill rate, certainly over short time periods, using this approach. So once we, did some rigorous testing on this and sort of validated the concept of the technology, the next step was really to scale it up and to roll it out in the field. And I was less involved with this part, but there was a joint venture that was formed with colleagues in India. And there was a large amount of customer consultation to figure out, what aspects of the toilet were most important to people. And it's a really good time to invest in sanitation or to do sanitation projects in India because of Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on increasing access to sanitation in that country and subsidizing toilet building there. But I guess I would say it was a great opportunity for researchers because from my group, because several thousand of these are now installed in India. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, I occasionally send students out there to track, what's going on with these toilets. So we know the installation dates of lots of these toilets. We know the dimensions, and we can estimate the fill rate of the latrines over time. Because it's one thing doing experiments over short time periods, but we want to know, are these toilets going to be sustainable over several years? And so, in true academic fashion, we really modeled the crap out of this project. So if you ask someone, how do you measure the fill rate of a pit latrine? It might sound simple at first, but when you think about it, well, how is the waste being introduced? Is it uniform? How do you estimate the depth of the waste? And so what we did was we basically did some laser measurements along a grid in each of the latrines that we opened up, and we're able to do some calculations to estimate the fill rate with quite good mathematical accuracy. And as I said, what we showed there, it was that it's the fill rate compared to a normal pit latrine with the same number of users and equivalent kind of conditions was filling up significantly more slowly, probably about half as quickly. So I mean that's a big benefit. There are other side benefits of the tiger toilet that came about, which we didn't expect initially. So a lot of users reported lower odor because the worms actually actually are quite quick at consuming the waste. And another student who I sent out to India, he actually put some infrared cameras in some of the toilets in the container where the waste was introduced. And I'm not going to play the video here, but this video is quite a big file actually, but it shows that when the waste is introduced, the worms actually come right out of the ground, and you can see the time scale when we run the video, and they actually consume the waste quite rapidly. And as I say, the vermicompost that they produce is sterile, odorless residual material. So that also gives confidence that, you know, even after 3 or 4 years of some of these latrines running, the worms were still active. It was still a robust population, and they were still able to degrade the waste quite quickly in these latrines. So the idea is that you seed it initially with worms. They can be local worms. They don't have to be worms from the UK. And then really, you know, as long as the worm population, the mass of the worms that you've included is appropriate for the number of users, the population is more or less self-regulating over time. I see a raised hand there. Carl, are you able to address that?
I don't see raised hands. I know audio quality is still challenging. We found that actually, at least people who have audio ability, if you unmute, it gets less cracked. I know everyone else doesn't have that ability. I don't see a raised hand button for that. So just keep going along. I'll try to figure it out in the background.
Okay, sorry for the sound quality, yeah. So that was the idea behind the tiger toilet. It was addressing the fact that the latrines will fill up. Another big problem with the pits is that they will leach contaminants into groundwater. And there's a lot of guidance already for contaminant leaching in terms of microbial contaminants, in terms of how far, for example, a well should be from a latrine. There's less clear guidance on chemical contaminants, though, and we did a study in around Kathmandu where actually a lot of the wells there are contaminated with nitrate. And the nitrate doesn't come from fertilizers or other sources being applied to the land. We think, certainly in certain parts of Kathmandu, it's more likely coming from nitrogen in the latrines. And so we did a modeling study and then a field study to investigate how you could estimate what would be the risk of nitrate contamination of wells from latrines, and what could we do to mitigate against that. And so this is just a really simple sort of advection dispersion model where we took some field measurements of what the nitrogen levels were within the pits, but also, you know, based on literature values. And then you could estimate various parameters to do with differences in the soil conditions, for example, which would affect whether you have any kind of nitrification and denitrification of the organic nitrogen, and also things like the porosity of the soil, and also the recharge rate of the groundwater from water trickling down through the soil, for example. So using that model, we could then estimate basically how quickly the nitrogen moves from the bottom of the pits down into the subsurface, and also estimate what the concentrations of that would be within wells, you know, of various hypothetical depths. And we then did sort of a field study in Kathmandu where we looked at 3 communities in particular that had different types of wells. Some were tube wells, some were shallow dug wells, and also different soil types. And so we were able to link, you know, some of the risk information that we got from our modeling to those parameters. Although one of the sort of surprising things that we saw was that there was also a fairly clear link also to practices to do with maintaining the toilets. So where communities were emptying the toilets more frequently, there appeared to be generally a lower risk of nitrogen contamination in wells of a similar distance to communities where they weren't emptying so frequently. So another problem with pits, and something that has to be taken into account when installing latrines, and also something to think about in terms of if you have an area that has a high water table, you know, the most basic form of toilet, a pit latrine, is probably not going to be applicable in those kinds of areas because of this risk of chemical contamination. Another project, sort of ongoing work, is looking at what we do with the contents from pits. And you know, if you're lucky enough to live on a fairly wide street, you might be able to get a vacuum a pump down to suck out the waste from your latrine. In a lot of cases, especially in urban slums, you don't have room for that though, and you might have to use something like the gulper, which was developed by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as shown on the left there, which uses sort of a foot pump, or sorry, it's a manually operated pump, as you can see there. There's certainly a need for solutions, for sort of low-cost solutions to empty pits, especially maybe deeper pits. Even if we do safely empty those pits, what do we do with the contents? You know, I mentioned earlier, quite often there's no safe disposal option. And so there's a current sort of movement in sanitation to think about sanitation not so much as just a technology, like what type of toilet should we install, but also as a service. So in other words, there are a number of service models that have built up around the world where a company will supply you with the toilet, which has a container in it, and they will come and take the container away, and they will do some value recovery from the waste in the container and give you a clean container. It's almost like a garbage collection service that we might be used to, but it's for toilet waste. And it has the benefit of therefore making the whole fecal sludge management process safe, because, you know, they're considering what happens in every step of the way. And some of the valuable products that you might recover might be, for example, soil enhancer, as in this example, or it could be, for example, biogas if you were to try to recover energy from that waste. So I think I think this is something we're going to see more of actually in the future, because it has worked quite well in some places. And I'm really interested to know sort of what are the barriers to these service models getting off the ground, and why might they work better in some places than others. And I think that's a question not just for engineers, but also for economists and also for social scientists also, to understand whether this is acceptable to people, what would be their concerns with this approach, how much would they be willing to pay for this kind of service. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting interdisciplinary problem, but I think it probably is a big part of the solution for sanitation, especially in urban centers going forward. As I said, once you recover the waste, there's various things you could do with it. You can make soil enhancer out of it. You could also recover biogas from it, in the same way that we treat sludge from wastewater treatment plants. You could also digest sludge from latrines. And this is a table from a paper we published, a review paper we published a few years ago, which estimates how much yield of biogas you could get per person per day. And you can see the yield is pretty low per person. And there are benefits of scale basically when it comes to biogas recovery. And it also tends to be more cost effective if you mix the latrine waste with other forms of waste, so co-digest the waste. So for example, with livestock waste, as you see there, has a much higher biogas yield. In terms of the pig manure there on the top of the slide. Also, there might be a collection of food waste, for example, so you could co-digest with food waste in some cases. But generally, biogas recovery of waste from fecal sludge has really increased dramatically, especially in China and India is where the most of these are installed around the world. And it sort of also provides a nice side benefit if you are using the waste from your domestic biogas digester to produce, for example, cooking gas for biogas stove. So that means that you're not only addressing sanitation, but you're also improving air quality within homes by allowing people to avoid having to burn dirty fuels in their homes. This is another table from that earlier review that we published. And it's clear, though, that biogas doesn't work everywhere. And a lot of these biogas plants that have been installed, going back to the 70s even, are no longer functional for a range of reasons. They're not necessarily a plug and play kind of solution. And you do have to make sure that there's appropriate skill available for operation and maintenance. there's also some temperature and climate factors which affect the speed of the digestion and the effectiveness of the digestion. So I guess what I would say overall with biogas is I think it's a promising part of the solution for sanitation going forward in terms of safe and sustainable sanitation and disposing of the fecal sludge. But it's something it's not a no-brainer and something that's going to work necessarily in every case. So another option that currently a researcher in my group is looking into is whether we could pyrolyze the waste. So maybe collect it and pyrolyze it in a centralized facility. And so pyrolysis would produce, it could produce a range of different products. It could produce oil and gas, excuse me, which the heat could be heated. And you could also produce char from that, which could be used as a soil enhancer. So the nice thing about pyrolysis, I guess, is that you could tailor the products depending on what the most beneficial product is for your particular location. And also we think that the research that we're doing is looking at how the feedstock qualities affect the products. So for example, if you take waste from a urine diversion toilet versus from a normal septic tank or pit latrine, is the char that's produced equally valuable in terms of the nutrient content or any different? So it's possible, therefore, that the type of sludge disposal method or value recovery method that you put in place is also has to be carefully thought of in terms of how it links to the type of toilet that's being used in that particular area. And we did sort of a back of the envelope modeling calculation to figure out would it ever make sense really to do pyrolysis of pit latrine sludge in terms of an energy generating kind of endeavor. Pyrolysis has been used for destroying wastewater sludge for a while, but fewer people have looked at it from a pit latrine sludge standpoint. And in some ways, pit latrine sludge you might think is better actually for pyrolysis because it might have a lower water content than the sludge that comes from wastewater sewage. And really the water content is the key thing. And if you can dry the sludge and get the water content down below about 55%, it starts to become a positive energy benefit kind of thing to do. So again, I guess something to think about if you're starting research or if you're starting a business, for example, on some type of value recovery from waste is to really do sort of a back of the envelope calculation to make sure that you are going to be able to produce products that are not going to be costly for you to produce, put it that way. And then the last few slides are really just about the impact of sanitation on health, which is probably the first thing that we think of when we think of a benefit of improving sanitation. But there's been a lot of studies recently, actually, sort of large random controlled trials, for example, which have shown that it's really hard actually to show that sanitation has beneficial impacts, even on fecal oral diseases or diarrhea. And I think there's a number of ranges for that. It's very hard to design random controlled trials to isolate a specific disease to a specific factor in developing countries. People could get diarrhea from poor nutrition, from poor hygiene and hand washing. There's a range of different factors that would have to be taken into account. And so some research that we've been involved in recently has been looking specifically at a disease called schistosomiasis, which I think is a bit more interesting than fecal oral diseases like cholera, for example. So the life cycle of this disease is that people who are infected shed a form of the parasite, which infects snails, which then shed out these things called cercari, shown in number 5 there in the diagram, which penetrate through the skin of other people as they come in contact with water that contains the cercari. And so you'd think that sanitation here would be beneficial because it would prevent infected people from passing through their urine or their feces the parasite into water bodies, and therefore you'd reduce the number of snails getting infected and producing these things called cercari there in number 5, which penetrate into other people's skin. But if you look at the life cycle of the disease, it only takes about one infected snail to yield about 20,000 cercari over its lifetime. And so if you think about this carefully, the uptake of sanitation and the usage of the sanitation is actually critical when it comes to schistosomiasis, if it's going to have any kind of impact. Because even if you have a small number of people who don't have access to the toilets or are not using them properly, the risk in terms of the environmental risk of infection of other people is still quite very high. So it's definitely not a linear one-to-one relationship normally between sanitation coverage and disease reduction. So if you improve access to sanitation by 90% in a community, that doesn't mean you're going to reduce diarrheal disease by 90%, and certainly you're not going to reduce schistosomiasis by 90% by doing so. So I think that's another area where quite often in the sanitation research, you're missing data on that. So there's good data from the engineers in terms of how many toilets were installed, but there's much less data on whether people are actually using the toilets consistently, which comes down to a behavioral or a health education kind of challenge. Or what's the degree of coverage, what percentage of people actually have access to that toilet within the community. Because, if your neighbor doesn't have a toilet and you do, the benefit of your toilet to yourself is greatly reduced. And so when we started this research, we did, first of all, what's called a systematic review. This is a very common research methodology, especially in medicine, where lots of studies have been done looking at health outcomes from a particular set of interventions, normally drugs, for example. And in this case, we looked at the studies that have been done on sanitation, and we summed up, I think it came to several hundred studies, and looked at what was the reduction in risk from people having sanitation. And the analysis showed that there was a statistical association between access to sanitation and reduced schistosomiasis. But we noticed that a lot of the studies had a lot of limitations. So they, for example, had socioeconomic confounding. So they were maybe comparing, richer people who don't really ever have contact with water and have toilets, versus maybe poorer people who are in occupations where they have to have contact with water all the time, like fishermen, for example. So, really hard to tell whether the sanitation was actually the difference between the communities that were being compared. Also, quite a lot of these studies were done by public health or health experts, as opposed to engineers, and the description of the sanitation was very poor. So they would say, yes, this community had toilets, nothing about what type of toilet, how many toilets there were, what the coverage or the usage was. And so we felt that we would look into this in greater detail. And so I guess the question that we faced was, how do you assess the goodness of sanitation, the quality of the sanitation? And the work that was done in Ethiopia that we were involved in involved several thousand schools and about 50 kids in each of the schools. There's 1,600 schools and about 50 kids in each school. And there was health data being collected in those schools from those 50 kids in each school on infections with schistosomiasis, but also other worm-based diseases, and also things like anemia and stunting. And the researchers from Imperial and the survey teams that they were training were going into these schools and applying this metric, this sort of sanitation score for each school, in terms of looking at things like, is it a shared latrine between boys and girls? Are there doors on the latrines? What type of sanitation is it? What's the condition of the floor? So really, a much more robust description and quantification of the quality of the sanitation in the scores, which allowed us a statistical basis for really doing some more robust investigation into the impact of sanitation specifically on schistosomiasis. And so the take-home message from that was really that from our analysis, there actually was not a very strong link between sanitation and schistosomiasis. There was with other types of worms, like hookworm, for example, and that makes sense based if you know about the life cycle or the transmission mechanism for hookworm, which is very much from coming in contact with contaminated soil. whereas schistosomiasis, as I said earlier, it's more linked to water contact. So unless you have a very high level of sanitation coverage, I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a measurable or a noticeable reduction in schistosomiasis risk. So if you're interested in that work, it's an ongoing project. We're also looking at how to treat water to make it safe from the cercaria that cause the illness. And the webpage for the project is provided there if you wanted to check that out at some point. So just about to the end of the presentation, some take-home messages. As I say, I'm guessing most of you guys are scientists and engineers, and I think you really have crucial roles in the future, in your future careers, to play alongside other disciplines. It's not just an engineering challenge for sure. But I think sometimes the engineering and the science challenge is downplayed compared to the maybe economic or behavioral challenge. And I hope I've shown you today in the presentation that there actually are some big technical challenges that have to be overcome with creative thinking and good engineering. Basic pit latrines are better than having nothing, but they will eventually fill up and they might contaminate groundwater. And you know, a place where engineering innovation is really needed is toilets for areas with high water tables where you can't dig latrines very easily, or also maybe portable or temporary latrines, for example, in refugee situations. It's important to always think about the end user and involve them. You know, no point designing a technology that works great in theory or at pilot scale or in the lab if people aren't willing to buy it, or if it doesn't take into account the key things that are most important to them in the toilet, things like smell, for example. Contain the waste now, which is crucial to meet the definition of improved sanitation, but don't forget its long-term fate. So where will it end up eventually? Is it really a sustainable technology? If we come back to the technology in 5, 10, 15 years, are people still going to be able to safely use it? Or is it going to be, you know, really a hazard for the users? Is it really waste? You know, should we just dispose of it, or are there some valuable products that can be recovered? And I think you know, there's a lot of work going on to really develop service models, as I said, that try to maximize this value recovery, and that's a key part in making those service models work, I think, ultimately. And finally, you know, in terms of improving health, sanitation is only a piece of the puzzle. It depends on uptake and coverage of the sanitation, and also the type of disease that you're talking about specifically, and understanding what's the transmission cycle of that disease. So while sanitation definitely has tons of benefits, and I'm not saying sanitation is useless by any means, you have to be careful in your expectations in terms of what the health impacts are going to be from a sanitation intervention alone. So yeah, again, just to finish off, keep in mind the 2 school buses, and to acknowledge researchers and contributors who provided some of the figures and photos in the presentation, including some specific photo credits there that were not my own, which I pilfered. And I'm happy, Carl, if you want to make this presentation available, but for each of the projects, I've provided sort of some DOI links if you want to read more about some of the projects I've talked about today. So sorry for the sound quality, but I hope you found it interesting.
Okay, right on. Thank you very much.